Welcome to the Filmlinks Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 38, Charming Chaplin.
Yes, it is, Jonathan. You know, I've noticed we've had a couple different kinds of episodes on this podcast over this first year of ours. And there's some that I expect are going to be really, really insightful and really, really great. And they are. And that's always amazing. And there's ones that I don't know what they're going to be like because I don't know anything about the topic. And then they turn out to be really, really interesting. And I really enjoy exploring those topics. And then there's this episode, which I expected to be really, really interesting and really, really great research dive. And then it exceeded my expectations by many, many miles. It was just incredible.
Yeah, Charlie Chaplin is so iconic from the very beginnings of film history and all the way across the world, coming from the silent film era where, you know, these films can be distributed anywhere just by replacing title cards. And we've talked about some of this stuff before, but never have we looked at someone who has crossed borders the way that Charlie Chaplin has, because not only are the film's silent, and so the title cards can be interchanged with whatever language, but the language of physical comedy is so universal and so unculturally bound that anyone from anywhere in the world can watch a Charlie Chaplin film and just, you know, bust out laughing at the way that he handles his body and his various interactions and situations that he finds himself in. And we see the implications of that and the legacy of Charlie Chaplin all the way up till this day. And we probably will for the rest of film history.
Yeah, and he's maybe the most talented person we have yet to talk about on this podcast. He just bubbles over with charm and charisma and talent in almost every area of filmmaking. And it'll be really exciting to dive into that today. But before we talk about the films that he made, let's give a little bit of background about the man himself, Charlie Chaplin. He was born in 1989 in London, more than likely. No one can actually confirm that, and Charlie himself was just told that as a story when he was a kid. But he doesn't have a birth certificate, so it's really anyone's guess. He started acting as a kid. His mother helped him get into acting. And as he became an adult, he got involved in traveling acting troupes and vaudeville performances and eventually moved to America, where in 1914, he eventually played a bit role as a con artist in the Keystone film Making a Living. And that was his first ever film appearance. And by the next year, 1 year later, 1915, he was a worldwide celebrity, the first international film star. And we'll be talking a lot about today, like what about the films he made lent themselves to be so global. But seriously, by only a year later, he was a superstar worldwide, mostly because of his tramp character. And he had, he even had like merch, like Charlie Chaplin, like dolls in stores all over the world. It's really amusing. Go look up pictures of that. Really, really cool. And one other really significant thing that he did outside of the films he made that we should talk about is he founded United Artists, which was a fairly important film studio in the early film days. It is now owned by MGM and doesn't really do much other than be a name. But it was founded by Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and the infamous D.W. Griffith in the very early days of film, and played a very big role in the early shaping of what film came to be.
Yeah, and so the movies that we'll be talking about today are beginning with The Gold Rush, which is kind of the quintessential film of the tramp character as he is prospecting for gold. And this film was made in 1925, and then later, after the invention of sound, Charlie Chaplin revisited it and took out the title cards and narrated it in 1942. So we'll be talking about both of those and its legacy versus the legacy that Chaplin wanted it to have.
Yeah, and our second film is going to be Modern Times, maybe considered by many to be the best film he ever made from 1936. And this is the first film where we ever hear Charlie Chaplin's voice. It's often referred to as the last silent film Charlie Chaplin ever made, and we'll get into that because for the most part it is silent. But it was made well into the sound era of Hollywood.
Yeah, it definitely has a foot in both worlds. And then finally, we transition to complete talking picture in The Great Dictator from 1940. And this is the first pure talkie starring Charlie Chaplin. And it's also the most political commentary that we get from Charlie Chaplin the year before the United States enters World War II. And we'll talk about how all that plays out into the comedy and all that.
Okay, and for our first film, we're going to head on out to the Klondike and talk about the Gold Rush. Jonathan, do you want to tell us what that one is all about?
Yeah, so the Gold Rush in 1925, and they're both essentially the same plot. We'll talk about a little bit of the differences in the re-release. And it's also might be a little hard to give a comprehensive flow of the plot of these movies because a lot of times they begin to feel like a series of gags and scenes and little vignettes, but they do have a complete kind of follow through. So instead, let's just kind of talk about the different characters in this film, and then we can kind of get into some of the situations they find themselves in later. So we have the tramp. He's out there prospecting for gold, and he ends up making his way, almost getting lost, but finds this cabin in the middle of the Arctic wilderness, and it's occupied by Black Larson, who is an outlaw. And so there's tension there between them being stuck trying to survive in the wilderness and also trying to survive themselves. And then we also have Big Jim, who is big. He literally gets mistaken for a bear at some point. And then he finds gold and then gets blown away in a blizzard and loses his memory and eventually has to find his way back to it later on. And then at some point, the tramp makes his way into a little town and meets Georgia. Cue dramatic title card. And she is kind of a flapper, kind of party girl. And she is in love with Jack, who is literally denoted as Jack was a ladies' man. So we have that character.
Wait, no, she's not in love with Jack. She hates Jack.
She is in love with him in the 1925 version.
Oh, right. Okay,
yeah.
proceed.
So starting in 1925, we'll talk about how that changes later on. But she's in love with Jack. They have kind of a weird on-off relationship. And Charlie Chaplin falls in love with Georgia. So there's kind of a love triangle going on there because she messes with his head a little bit and stuff. And then Big Jim comes back to find Charlie Chaplin to take him back to where the gold was because he remembers and Big Jim doesn't. So in the middle of all of these things, just so many, again, little snippets and antics ensue. And it's almost like a series of Bugs Bunny cartoons. And we'll kind of talk about how those kind of comedic bits come from this era of silent comedy. And so all of it plays together into this hour and a half long movie that is just incredibly funny.
Right. And before we talk about like the meat of the film, can we go back to the bear for a second, Jonathan?
Yes.
Because that bear actually has like a film career. Like he's in multiple films. His name is John Brown, and he also appeared in The General with Buster Keaton.
Buster Keaton's probably most famous film.
Yeah, also incredible. Also a key source of physical comedy that we'll be talking about today. The physical comedy, not Keaton. He deserves his own episode. But John Brown almost has enough material for his own episode, and I find that fascinating. Right. So, put that in your pocket for the next party you're at where film trivia is appreciated. John Brown the Bear, film star.
Silent films did enjoy using their real and dangerous animals because, again, this is kind of coming out of the tradition of vaudeville and almost like circus acts and stuff like that. That was the kind of entertainment that eventually was just put on film to be distributed to more and more places. So we're seeing that until people realized, hey, this is kind of dangerous, and stopped using so many real animals.
Maybe
like
let's
lions
use a bear
and bears.
suit.
Right.
I mean, they sprung for a chicken suit. They didn't go for a human-sized chicken, like a real human-sized chicken.
We do have a chicken suit, and that is actually pretty funny. And it was a really good looking suit too, honestly.
Yeah. And while we're kind of in this area, let's talk about the visual effects that went into this film, because silent films. You don't think 1920 movies, you don't think special effects. You think CGI. When you think special effects, you think Lord of the Rings, you think Transformers. But a lot of really innovative in-camera and practical special effects were developed in the very early days of cinema to accompany and make possible a lot of the shots that we have on screen. For instance, the opening shot in The Gold Rush, where Charlie Chaplin is walking along a cliff and John Brown the bear appears behind him. He doesn't notice him, of course, and gives him a little gag that way. But he's walking along the edge of this very, very slim cliff, and it looks like either a very dangerous real location to shoot on, or a very expensive set to build. But essentially, the way they did it was paint over a section of the glass, the part of the frame that would be the drop off of the clip, and put that glass in front of the lens of the camera. So essentially, all you were recording onto film that was happening in real life was what you could see on the section of the glass that wasn't painted, and the rest would be filled in afterwards. So you had a composite happening in camera, essentially a Photoshop that was done physically off of a computer on camera in real time on set to achieve what is a really convincing look on screen.
Yeah, so in that case, all you have to do is build a little tiny step, basically, that Charlie Chaplin can walk on, and he can do, he kind of like skips around the corner and like hops on one leg, and you're like, oh my gosh. But really, he's probably a couple feet off the ground. And then, as we were talking about with the chicken suit, one of the other cool things that they would do in the old days, which is so simple now, like we've talked about with so many things when we're going back to this time period, but dissolving. So in the cabin, Big Jim gets hungry at some point because they have no food, and so he starts to see Charlie Chaplin as a chicken. And what happens is the shot will fade from a shot of Charlie Chaplin to a shot of a gigantic chicken suit in the spot where Charlie Chaplin was, which seems really basic now, but that was actually done in camera when they were shooting, and they had special cameras with little VFX functions built in, like a dissolve mode, where you can set it to dissolve out, and then you record and the film will kind of fade, and then you revert back to the beginning of that dissolve and switch it to dissolve in, and then you change your actor or put the chicken suit on him, and then you record over the dissolve and it fades up into the chicken suit. And so then what Charlie Chaplin added to this to make it even more seamless is if the chicken is flapping its wings, Charlie Chaplin will flap his arms as the dissolve is happening, and that just helps make it even more seamless. And it's all these simple things that help sell the gag and also are precursors to a lot of things that we see even today.
Yeah, and it is really, really convincing. Like, it works. It doesn't take you out of the space of the film or the gag at all. And of course, part of the comedic gag is kind of a nod and wink acknowledgement that you are watching something that isn't real, because it is a hallucination. But that's kind of the sign of good special effects, is when they don't take you out of the story and out of this comedic space that the film wants you to be in. And instead helps enhance what you're watching, which is exactly what this accomplishes. So in that regard, it is spot on special effects. It's exactly what you want.
Right. And another part that really, where Charlie Chaplin uses a practical effect to make really a kind of edge of your seat type of scene, is when at some point the cabin in kind of a ridiculous cartoonish fashion, gets blown away by a blizzard and lands on the edge of a cliff and is tilting back and forth depending on which side of the cabin Charlie Chaplin and Big Jim are standing on. And so you're kind of terrified that the house is going to fall, or the little cabin's going to fall off the cliff. And this was actually done by what we think, since none of these effects there were no behind the scenes videos or anything like that back then. But we have a little clip of a magazine that shows a picture of a house set, or the little cabin set, literally being hung from the rafters by a series of pulleys. And then there would be very strong, assumedly, crew members on either side pulling the strings to change the angle of the house. And then you literally have Charlie Chaplin working against gravity in each of these scenes, where every time they kind of shift, the angle of the tilt changes and it becomes steeper and steeper. And even today, you're like, oh my gosh, stop doing that. And you're just terrified that they're going to fall off. But that was done in camera and is a precursor to a lot of kind of set builds that we do today. So if you think of the hallway scene in Inception, where Joseph Gordon-Levitt is running around in practically zero gravity, and each time a different wall has the gravity on it. And that was literally built in a rotating set that could be rotated 360 degrees. All of those ideas and those practical set builds are being originated here in films like this, where the silent film people who didn't have computers to make it happen were trying to make it happen in real life. And that adds to, aside from doing like tilt the camera and then have the actors fake falling over, adding that actual element of gravity just sells it all the much more.
And another quick note on, especially on the chicken costume scene in particular, is that Charlie Chaplin directed all of these too. He wore many hats on set. He wrote, starred, directed. Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
Okay. You get one. No, I'm kidding. Please sneak more into the podcast. Yes, so he wore many hats, all of which were bowler shaped. He directed all of these. He starred in all of these. He wrote all of these films that we're talking about today, and many more. And as we'll talk about, he scored all of these. And I know we've talked about how silent films didn't really have a standard score, and we'll get into that. And the year 1942 is important, but we're not quite there yet. But on the note of direction, he originally had another person acting in the chicken suit for the scene where the chicken hallucination happened. And eventually he just wasn't happy with how they were doing it. So he stepped in. He was like, I'm going to do this now. And that's a very small incident, but it's very indicative of his overall kind of meticulousness and precision in how he directed and created his works, and how much he loved to exert his creative control over every part of the film. And that's kind of important to how each of these films feels so much like a Charlie Chaplin film. It's not just Charlie Chaplin, the actor, and another director's on another director's platform. It's Charlie Chaplin in a Charlie Chaplin situation in a signature Charlie Chaplin shack. By the way, we have two of those this week, actually. Or actually three. There's two in Gold Rush and one in Modern Times.
Right.
But all very Charlie Chaplin touches that he puts in himself, and kind of asserts as not only the actor, the embodiment of the Tramp character, but as the director and the creative auteur of the material that he makes. And then bringing it back to our house on the cliff, let's talk about the physical comedy and that acting in particular. And how Charlie Chaplin manages to be so klutzy and charming and sympathetic all at the same time. And meanwhile, all doing some very physically demanding things. Like the acting he was doing wasn't just like easy acting. It was very, very physically demanding.
Yeah, and he does that in all of these films, even through The Great Dictator, at which point he was like 50 years old. So he definitely had a commitment to this craft, and was probably one of the longest surviving vaudevillians, or at least in the kind of vaudevillian tone of his work that he's making. But the way that the comedy comes off, I guess there are a couple different ways. I haven't taken the time to categorize them, but one of the most basic ways is thwarted expectations. So a really simple one from the beginning of the movie is where Charlie Chaplin is walking through the snow and he falls down, and then he stands up and puts his cane down to lean on it, and he just goes straight through the snow like it's deep enough that his whole cane gets swallowed up, and then he just stands up and walks off. And so, that's a falling down gag, and it's a thwarted expectation gag. And then there's other things. I don't know how to describe it, but there are several instances like this where in the cabin, Big Jim and Black Larson are fighting over a shotgun, and they're kind of wrestling and spinning around the cabin. And Charlie Chaplin is trying to get out of the aim of the barrel of the gun, and everywhere he moves, the barrel of the gun follows him until at some point they turn away from him and he isn't looking, and the gun goes off and he thinks he's gotten shot. And so it's that comedy of you set up what Charlie Chaplin is thinking and how he keeps getting followed by the gun, and then what he's thinking when the gun goes off in a different place. And I don't know how to really describe that, but I feel like that happens several times in these movies. There's another instance in The Great Dictator that's pretty similar. But it's things like that. And then, there's other ones as far as hitting people, I guess. I don't know how to describe that either. I'm sure that there are terms for these things that I just am not aware of.
Right. We don't know too much about acting, but we'd like to learn more. And Charlie Chaplin is certainly one of the keys to study if you're at all interested in doing comedic acting. Because I think, like we've talked about before in especially the Edgar Wright episode, a lot of comedy can be portrayed not just through dialogue, but through the physicality of a scene. In the Edgar Wright episode, we talked about like where you can put the camera and how you can set up expectations and subvert them that way.
The other thing we talked about in the Edgar Wright episode was the use of editing to convey the comedy. And there's very little of that in these movies. It is much more theatrical in terms of setting up a scene and just letting it play out, because that's where Charlie Chaplin came from, was doing comedy on stage, where it's just, watching it happen and watching the characters interact, and seeing it all in one take makes it feel much more like a dance, because it's all choreographed and it's all very specific and timed very specifically, and you can't cheat it very much with the editing, as opposed to with the exception of little things like we talked about with the chicken dissolve and stuff like that.
Right. And it's very common to refer to Charlie Chaplin as a dancer. Like we said, he's a man of many bowler hats, and dancer hat is one of them. And he shines, and especially with the music that is used in these films,
especially later on.
And I think we're about to talk about the 1942 re-release. But it feels like a dance. It feels like a comedic dance. And one of the things that I don't know if Charlie Chaplin really started it, but he did use it to a very effective extent, was kind of juxtaposing the music with the physical comedy that was happening on screen. So a lot of times the rhythm would embody the comedy, but sometimes the tone of the music would be sad when it needed to be a sad scene. And there are some sad scenes because Charlie Chaplin's tramp is a character who almost needs to be down on his luck to be as charming as he is. And in many,
it's a comedy of sympathy.
Yeah. So there's a lot of scenes that are really like, some scenes are genuinely sad for a moment until they start bringing the laughs again. And it's a good way to mix that in with this very sympathetic music in those scenes. There's a couple in the dance hall like that where Charlie Chaplin is pining over Georgia, but Georgia's paying no attention to him. And then, of course, there's still gags happening in comedy, but the gags are even funnier in contrast to the sympathetic music and tone of the scene.
Yeah, and that gets into the 1942 re-release in which Charlie Chaplin both created synchronized music for the story, so that certain sound beats would happen with the comedy. It's not like Foley or anything that's specific to what's happening in the scene. It's just music that kind of accentuates it and is timed to it. And also, he kind of narrates it. He takes out all of the title cards, and instead, it's just Charlie Chaplin kind of almost at some points like audiobooking it, where a character will mouth something, and Charlie Chaplin will say, "Get out," says Big Jim. And Charlie Chaplin says, "I'm trying," and whatever. So he's kind of almost telling it as a story to accompany the visuals, which I guess we can kind of debate the effectiveness or necessity of that, because it seemed to kind of play off well enough with just the title cards and the fact that it's a silent film. You kind of just give it that pass anyway, and it just works with the visuals without all of that like explaining to us what is happening. And there's also a couple plot changes that are interesting because I think Charlie Chaplin wanted to be remembered for this movie, so he made some very specific changes when he revisited it later on. So kind of one of the main plot changes that was made is actually a very small edit that changes the perception of the movie a lot, in which a big part of the movie is that Georgia had found out that the tramp was in love with her, had a crush on her or whatever, and so she kind of decided to play a trick on him or mess with his mind a bit and say, "Hey, we'll come over here and have New Year's dinner with you," and then just totally stands him up. And so we see him sitting there waiting for New Year's dinner, and then he can hear from the party hall all the singing of Auld Lang Syne and all the party happening, and he goes over there and realizes that they didn't come at all. And then Georgia kind of feels bad about it, and she has an argument with her boyfriend Jack about it. And then later she gives a note to Jack that says, "I'm so sorry for what I did last night. I want to make it up to you," or whatever. And then Jack sees the tramp, and he decides to mess with him, and he gives Georgia's letter that was meant for Jack to the tramp, and then the tramp thinks that she's apologizing to him. And so it makes this kind of thing where you don't really like Georgia. They end up together at the end, but she really didn't have any affection for the tramp. She felt a little sorry for him just because she was mean to him. However, in the re-release, Charlie Chaplin has taken out the bit where Georgia gives the note to Jack, and instead all we see is a waiter handing Charlie Chaplin the note that says, "I'm sorry, I apologize," or whatever. So it makes it so that Georgia actually is apologizing to Charlie Chaplin, and it's just that one little edit that changes our perception of Georgia going into the end of the film, which has actually changed a little bit too.
Yeah, they actually edit out the kiss at the end of the film in the re-released version. And I'm not really sure what effect that achieves. Maybe it feels more wholesome. I'm not sure.
It was a little forward for him to kiss her at the end, but I don't know. It wasn't a huge deal.
Yeah, it didn't. I don't think the end changed too much, but
honestly, the kiss would make more sense in this edited version when we know that Georgia actually does like the tramp.
Yeah, exactly. That's the bigger change. Is that Georgia's much more likable character, and that she is interested in the tramp, or at least becomes interested in the tramp, which is interesting. And that's kind of maybe the most interesting part of this whole re-release situation to me, is that this is Charlie Chaplin's take on a work of art he made like 20 years after he made it.
Yeah, almost a full 2 decades.
Yeah. And I mean, it's hard to say that you're really the same person 20 years later, at least like emotionally and like in terms of what experiences you've had.
Especially the life Charlie Chaplin had in Hollywood.
Oh gosh, yeah. That's a whole other topic. If you want to learn about Charlie Chaplin's personal life, go listen to You Must Remember This. They've got a couple episodes on him that will dive into that in depth. But his professional life, I'm sure he had a very different creative, maybe not very different, maybe that's not the right word, but a much more matured view creatively on what his work 20 years ago would have been. And maybe that's part of why he put the narration in there. Maybe he wanted to change the tonality of it. Because you're right, the narration isn't necessary to change the story, to tell the story. Heck, even the inner titles aren't really necessary to tell the story. All of the information is in the acting, especially Charlie Chaplin's acting. Like, you know what he's feeling at any moment, and you know what his goal is at any moment without even the inner titles. So maybe the narration was an effort to change the tone or tweak the tone here or there across the course of the film. Maybe it was just Charlie Chaplin experimenting with this new way to emphasize and tell the story now that he had sound to tell it. I mean, we know, like you said, that he rescored the whole film. And he scored all of his films after City Lights, and he also went back and rescored many of the ones that were made before City Lights, including The Gold Rush. And by the way, if you watch the 1925 version that is on Filmstruck, or the one that's on the Criterion DVD, then you will be watching Charlie Chaplin's score that has been altered. Its tempo's been altered here and there. I don't know much about music. I don't even know if I'm using the right words, but the tempo's been altered here and there to make it line up with the slightly different speed 1925 version.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way that these scores come together, because a lot of it is, it is custom, but a lot of it is very traditional songs, and you can kind of pick out the themes and the songs that you hear, and we'll talk about that a little bit, especially in The Great Dictator, where Wagner plays a big part as part of the joke and part of the story, because Wagner was actually Hitler's favorite composer.
Right. But especially in this one, I mean, there's Flight with the Bumblebees in this one.
Yeah, Flight with the Bumblebees. I think For He's a Jolly Good Fellow plays into one of these movies. I can't remember which one. And several other kind of tunes like that aren't called out specifically. But so he's not necessarily composing completely new music for all of these, maybe some of the bridges and stuff. But a lot of it is just really kind of classic tunes and music that he incorporates into his own physical comedy, and it works out really well.
Yeah, and he couldn't even read music properly. Like, he could play violin, but he could only he was more or less self-taught, I think. Don't hold me to that, but I know he couldn't read music.
He sings gibberish well.
We'll get to that in a second, but that kind of goes back to what I mentioned in the intro to this episode, is that this man is just so freaking talented. Like, to be able to coordinate his music that he doesn't even properly know how to play or read, his movements and his direction all in one to coordinate a film that just moves so gracefully, which is a weird thing to say for an era in which the pratfall was maybe the gold star of comedy, but it really is graceful. Like, all of his films have a certain amount of grace to them, like you're watching a dance.
Yeah, because as goofy and as silly as the falling down and stuff is, like, the fact that you can tell how choreographed and how specifically timed and blocked everything is, yeah, it does add that element of grace to it, and the silliness keeps it lighthearted and just makes it fun for really anyone. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in each of these movies, I was seeing the origins of comedy that came out many years later, and just noticing how much of our contemporary slapstick and physical comedy comes from this era, and even Chaplin specifically. And so when I was watching The Gold Rush, I was thinking a lot about Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry and those kind of cartoons where it's kind of cat and mouse, no pun intended, kind of stuff where the tramp is either running away or someone's chasing him and he kind of outsmarts them wittingly or unwittingly. Charlie Chaplin doesn't have necessarily the same intentionality that Bugs Bunny does, but he kind of has the same situations where he gets out of things by the most unconventional or unexpected ways, and it's a lot of that kind of almost even Scooby-Doo, like going around corners and coming in and out of doors at different times and stuff like that. So it's just interesting as we watched these movies, like which comedians I was thinking about, and then realizing, oh wait, this was before any of them. So that's one of the great things about watching these old movies is you can see where, your own tastes have come from.
On to our next film to talk about, Modern Times from 1936, originally intended to be a satire of the progression of technology and society in the 1930s. It kind of ends up being kind of relevant still today in the way that machines interact with humans in the workplace and in the economy, which I don't want to get into too much detail here. But essentially, Modern Times tells the story of our tramp character again, but he starts off with gainful employment as a factory worker, an overworked factory worker who kind of goes bonkers and becomes integrated with the machines at times and becomes kind of too machine-like to the point where he becomes absolutely loopy, gets tossed in
has a nervous breakdown.
Yeah, has a nervous breakdown, goes around wrenching people. Don't wear bolt-shaped buttons, just saying.
Ladies.
Oh, that scene. Okay, anyway. But he ends up in jail, and then he has a series of gags in jail. He gets kicked out of jail. He wants to go back to jail.
Can we just point out that there are cocaine gags in jail?
There are cocaine gags in jail. Very subtly. Well, I don't know how subtle nose powder is. I don't know. It's very confusing.
And that could be construed any other way.
Yeah. But I mean, at this point, Chaplin was working under United Artists, and that was his own studio. He could kind of do what he wanted, with a certain nod and a wink humor that is just quintessential of any comedian, especially the tramp. But he finds himself very hungry out on the streets because this film definitely addresses the fact that it takes place during the Great Depression. And there's a lot of characters, including our female lead, played by Paulette Goddard, who's essentially a street urchin?
Yeah, a gamin. There's a whole chapter in the book Les Miserables that explains what a gamin is, if you're interested.
Oh my gosh, Jonathan.
Hey, we gotta drop our literary references every other episode,
Hashtag lit nerd. Anyway, there's nothing wrong with that. Not
lit nerd, I like that.
It's a double entendre. Or is it entendre? I don't know. I don't speak French.
Entendre.
Entendre. But anyway, Charlie Chaplin is stuck out on the streets. He's trying to get back into jail. Paulette Goddard, who is, her dad has died. Her sisters has been taken into child services, or whatever the heck it was called in 1936. And she is trying to survive on her own on the streets and not get caught by the cops. They cross paths, and they both try to kind of just survive and escape and survive, escape the hunger of the streets, escape the persecution of the law, and just dream of a better life, but just survive to have a better life. And they go about trying to make that happen. There is a sequence where there's another shack. I mentioned the shack before, that they find and move into and try to make a new home. It's very reminiscent of the shack in the Gold Rush. And eventually Charlie Chaplin's character goes back to work at the factory, and of course more shenanigans ensue. and then there's another strike, and yada yada yada. It's all kind of a bit cyclical if you look at the work and no work factor, but really it's a story of survival in quote modern times.
Very, very good. Yeah. So,
thank you for the review.
So a lot of this comedy is, in this case, kind of playing off of machinery versus humanity, I guess. So we start off with Charlie Chaplin working at this assembly line, and so he's doing this thing where he twerks bolts like over and over and over again, and there's some great gags where he yawns and he misses some bolts and he has to run down the assembly line and he backs everyone else up, and then he has to catch up with himself, which he does masterfully. Like, can we just point out the fact that he hits all of those bolts and is kind of amazing. And what the bolts actually do or why he needs to tighten them is completely irrelevant. It's just literally a physical thing that Charlie Chaplin has created for himself to do. And then once he goes on his break, he kind of has this twitch where his arms keep doing the same thing. And it is at once being very funny because he starts just tightening every bolt that he comes across, or everything that looks like a bolt, including buttons on a woman's dress or whatever. And it's also, at the same time, a commentary on how kind of these mundane, repetitive tasks kind of seep into a person's brain if they don't have any fulfillment outside of that, and then it just becomes an automatic response that they can't even control anymore. So in this movie, we're starting to see how Charlie Chaplin is starting to incorporate a message into his movies, which will be kind of consummated in The Great Dictator, but we're definitely seeing traces of it here, even in I'm pretty sure it's the first shot, isn't it? The sheep shot?
The sheep shot.
Shot.
Let's say that 20 times fast.
Yes. Yeah, at the beginning of the film, there's a shot of a bunch of sheep kind of being herded through a gate, and there's one black sheep in the middle of the herd. And then we transition that into a shot of workers filing into a gate at a factory. So we're getting that idea of ideological montage that we talked about in the Soviet episode.
Oh, yeah, this is straight out of a Soviet film.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, literally, actually.
Yeah, and we have communist jokes later on in the movie. But yeah, it's that infusion of an ideal or a theme into the comedy. It's not just entertainment. It's entertainment and comedy with a purpose now.
Yeah. And if you're thinking about it from a 1936 point of view, or as best as I can assume a 1936 point of view in the middle of the Great Depression, a very sympathetic theme, where Charlie Chaplin's tramp character was perfectly suited to thrive in a 1936 entertainment industry. And you're right when we're talking about the Soviet montage in this, that opening shot. It actually, maybe it was just the topic of the film, but it actually reminded me a whole lot of the 1925 Sergei Eisenstein film Strike, or at least the slaughterhouse sequence in it, where a bunch of striking workers are killed, and then they intercut that with shots of cows being slaughtered. Obviously, no one's being slaughtered in modern times, but the cross symbology of industrial workers and farm animals, which would find its peak probably in the Animal Farm, is still present here in this film. And
yeah, you mean George Orwell's Animal Farm?
Yeah.
Now, I'm just clarifying this, not just any general farm.
No, not some random animal farm. Just yes, the specific George Orwell Animal Farm. And also, to throw it back to our Germany episode, the entire set design of the factory where Charlie Chaplin works looks like something straight out of Metropolis. Like oversized levers and conveyor belts, and there's a guy running around without a shirt pulling giant levers. And I was like, what's with factories and people not wearing shirts? But it was in Metropolis too. And both of those films came out before modern times. I don't know if if Sergei Eisenstein's film would have been available in the U.S. for Charlie Chaplin to see, but I do know that Charlie Chaplin was all for a U.S.-Soviet alliance to take down Hitler. Like that was like a big thing for him in the lead up for World War II. So it's entirely possible that he was interested in Soviet film as well. But yeah, there are definitely some foreign influences in this film.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Metropolis a little bit more when we get to the science fiction and visual effects elements of this movie. But just to keep with the hashtag #LitNerd kind of origins that this film may have drawn from, the element of Charlie Chaplin getting out of jail and trying to go back to jail just to get a meal and to get a place to sleep reminds me a lot of a short story by O. Henry about a hobo named Soapy, which is interesting. But it is literally a story of this guy who is homeless and it's cold and it's winter and he's just trying to get arrested so that he can at least have some food. And then by the end of the story, whenever he realizes that he shouldn't be breaking the law, he ends up getting arrested for loitering or something. So it is that ironic element, but it has a lot of parallels to the story of this, and that's a pretty old story, so I would imagine that may have had some influence on this one. And we can see how all of these different things are kind of being rolled up into one, and then we throw in all of the Charlie Chaplin antics, and we get one of his most iconic movies ever.
Right. And just to talk about him as a director in relation to him as an actor for a moment, you sometimes hear about an actor's talents being misused by a director, and that's something that is never at risk of happening with Charlie Chaplin directing his own films, and he does exactly that. Like, he knows exactly how best to use himself as an actor. Like, he knows his strengths in physical comedy, and he gives himself the spaces in which to move, the motivations in which to move, and the props with which to move on. So, like, when you were mentioning the conveyor belt scene, like, that is a scene designed for Charlie Chaplin. That is designed for him to shine in.
And even more so, the rollerblade scene.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good one. That is both him and Paulette Goddard's character. I can't even remember she has a name, but she's a generic street urchin. A gammon. He has gotten a job at a department store. I don't think they were malls at that point. I think they were just department stores. As a night watchman.
But it's multi-story.
It is like an old school, like, big department store, like Macy's in New York. And he uses his position as the night watchman to get food for him and Paulette Goddard's character. Like, they go into the cafe, the bakery in the department store and eat food there. And then they're, like, playing around, and they end up playing around on roller skates on, like, the third or fourth floor inside. And Charlie Chaplin ends up being blindfolded, and he's skating around on these roller skates near a balcony that has no railing. The railing is under construction or out of order or just plain gone, and it's just not there. And he keeps coming so close to it. Yeah. And, like, again, this is an old film. You never expect these special effects to land, but it does land.
Yeah, it's the same glass painting technique that we saw with the cliff in the Gold Rush.
Same exact one, and it is a tense scene. I have a hard time looking straight at it sometimes because I freak out a bit too much. But that's just a signal of how well done it is, and how well made the scene is to play to Chaplin's advantages. Like, if you want the tramp to shine, put him in movement. And the best way to make him move a bunch is to put him in some roller skates.
And that's what you're saying about his talents, is that Charlie Chaplin was an excellent roller skater. He's doing all kinds of turns and skating backwards and on one foot, and kind of, again, it's almost a dance on roller skates. And I believe that he used roller skates in several of his films because he was very good at it. And so, like you were saying, he can craft this scene that makes sense for the story, puts him on roller skates, which he is great at, and again feels very vaudevillian as just an act that you would put on, but he incorporates it into the story and creates a gag out of it and another edge of your seat kind of a thing, because he is coming so close to the edge. And then again, in almost a Bugs Bunny like move, only when he sees the edge, when he takes the blindfold off, does he become freaked out and starts like slipping on his roller skates and stuff like that. Where it's another comedy element that probably has a name that I don't know of, where the danger doesn't exist until you look at it, kind of a thing that you see mostly in cartoons, where someone will run off the edge of a cliff and then they'll look down, and once they see that there's no ground under their feet, they fall down. And again, those origins are starting in these old silent comedies.
Yeah, and you should watch all these films. They're fantastic. We say that every week. It's
there are very few exceptions to that on this podcast.
Yeah, King Kong, the 1970s version of King Kong.
2003 Pride and Prejudice.
2003
Sorry,
Pride
Mom.
and Prejudice. Yeah, but that's about it. But all the other ones you should definitely watch. Just watch, like, think about, try to take a step back, watch this moment a second time, and take a step back and try to just watch Charlie Chaplin after he's taken the blindfold off and after he's freaking out and he's like backpedaling on roller skates, not a little bit, but like frantically, like cartoonishly, like it looks like someone animated his legs, like 2 inches away from the drop. And of course the drop isn't really there, it's the painted on glass matte filter. I guess that would qualify as a filter. I don't know. Sort of pseudo filter. Yeah. Anyway, composite. Let's call it a composite. The painted on glass composite. And it's not like it's really funny, and we can wax poetic about how funny it is, but it is also just physically demanding. Like that wasn't an easy thing to do. Like Charlie Chaplin had to have been a physically fit dude to pull off the stuff he did. All of these silent film stars had to be like pretty physically in shape to do what they did. So on top of being these artists,
and again, he was probably in his 40s when this movie came out, just to throw that out there.
Yeah, what was it, 1889 to 1936? He was 46, 47?
Yeah.
Something like that. He wasn't super duper young, and he was still pulling off stuff like this. That's just so impressive. So they're creative geniuses, physically talented, graceful, artists, poets, definitely businessmen at the same time. Like I mentioned, he started United Artists. And on top of that, they're physically fit. And at one point, you just get a little jealous, and then you just forget about it and keep enjoying the movie.
Yeah, and as long as we're talking about that glass mat again, I meant to mention this earlier, but we're seeing, those effects, again, just to talk about the longevity of them. The glass mat is basically the same effect that they use even in the original Star Wars films, when you're seeing all of the Imperial guards as Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine are walking out of their thing in Empire Strikes Back. Those are pretty much all just painted on, so they didn't have to get all those extras. And same thing with a lot of the rebels at the end of A New Hope. It's just painted on, and then you film it through that. And I mean, that's the way you do it before you can digitally replace those sections of the film. And we could see how long that technique was in effect until the digital visual effects started to take more prevalence and are now the standard rather than the exception. Yeah.
And effective too for that long, which is really impressive.
Yeah, and as long as we're on the visual effects, we can talk about how in this film, it's kind of futuristic. Again, like we talked about, the comparison with Metropolis, there are a lot of things to talk about, especially in any of the factory scenes, because we have basically Skype communication, which we see in a lot of science fiction films, but this is pretty old. And we saw it in Metropolis, which was even older, where someone will basically Skype down to the workers in the factory and be talking to them. And we see that in this film in one hilarious instance where Charlie Chaplin is taking a smoke break in the bathroom and his boss Skypes down and goes, "Hey!" And Charlie Chaplin freaks out. And it's kind of a commentary on the startlingness of sound in film, because that's something we haven't talked about yet, is the fact that this film comes out well into the invention of sound and sync sound, and yet Charlie Chaplin still keeps it as primarily a silent film. He's kind of holding out, and this film has one foot in each era, where most of the gags are silent, but he throws in an extra element of sound. So for like these visual effects, we'll see sparks and stuff, and we can actually hear the electronic bzz, 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 and stuff like that, and the different things. But he's very selective. We're not hearing all of a complete soundscape. He picks only the very specific sound effects that will enhance the comedy of the scene. And it's really interesting. And there was actually a special feature on Filmstruck from the Criterion Collection about the visual effects and how the sound effects complement them in a way that he wasn't able to do in the silent-only era.
Yeah, and I find it interesting because you always hear Modern Times referred to as the last silent Charlie Chaplin film, and it's not. It feels like a silent film for most of it, just because that's Charlie Chaplin's style. That's where he's comfortable. That's where he can do his best work. So he plays a lot of his gags in silence. But he does use sound technology in here. Like you said, there is the boss Skyping in to talk to his different workers. There is a number of gags that are played with sound. For instance, when Charlie Chaplin is about to be released from jail, he's sitting around the warden's office, and the visiting parson has his wife waiting in the office as well. So they're both sitting on the couch drinking some tea, and there's a dog barking at them. Because as they drink tea, their stomachs start to rumble, as in they get gassy. And yeah, so 1936, we're staying mature here with the jokes, but definitely
Right.
playing it with audio. As each of their stomachs rumble in turn, the dog starts barking at both, and I'm not saying
And they're both trying to stay very poised. Like the fact that it's a
Oh, yeah.
parson's wife is a huge part of this joke.
Yeah,
It's trying to be very fashionable.
Yeah, the initial tension of the scene is key to the comedy of it, and I think the gag might play without sound, but it plays a million times better with sound.
Right.
Like that is a key element of the gag that is going on here. And of course, we can't forget that this is the film where the world at large, like, film audiences at large, heard Charlie Chaplin's voice for the first time. This is the first time where he actually opens up his mouth and says, quotes on this, words.
Right.
Because it's a totally made-up language. But at the very end, him and Paulette Goddard have found employment at a singing cafe where all the waiters sing, and Charlie Chaplin has to sing a song. At the very end, he's all freaking out because he can't sing, or he gets nervous, he forgets the words. And there's also this kind of like meta tension happening with the audience as well, because we're like, you have to assume, that 1936 viewpoint, and you kind of feel it nowadays in our modern times, this tension that this is a silent star and we're about to hear him speak. And for everybody else, like, I'm sure everybody in the audience was wondering, like, there's no way we're actually going to hear Charlie Chaplin sing. There's no way. And then he opens up his mouth and sings, and it's complete and utter gibberish, but it is hilarious.
Yeah, it almost sounds like French or one of the Romance languages, but it's not. And we'll see that kind of the way that Charlie Chaplin uses gibberish to sound like a very specific language, very specifically in The Great Dictator. But here, yeah, exactly. But here it's just really hilarious, and it is a way for him to use sound and yet make it still a silent gag, essentially, because we are still getting the entirety of the content of the song solely through the hand motions and the gestures that he makes, and the way he uses his body in the scene is just so hilarious. And it totally pays off this just building up to it and climaxing, and then afterwards he still goes back to his title cards after this part of the scene. But it's so funny. And again, if I can bring in just the influences that I was seeing coming out of this film, this one reminded me so much of Lucille Ball and scenes in I Love Lucy, where Lucy will be at Ricky's club and have to do a performance, like when she does the professor in her clown bit, and she just gets thrown into a situation and just starts, seemingly ad-libbing, but it's all very specifically choreographed and just so funny. And then even at the beginning with, again, the conveyor belt, it's very reminiscent. Of course, looking back on it now, it's reminiscent of the chocolate factory scene from I Love Lucy. So again, we're seeing all of these influences that are coming out of this era of film.
Yeah, and I just want to repeat it a little bit, emphasize it a little bit, how impressive the performance in the song scene is by Charlie Chaplin. Like how much he's not using a real language, but he communicates everything through his physical performance. Yeah. And he gets help from the tonality of his voice, which, by the way, Charlie Chaplin has a nice voice, which I've always found a little bit ironic, and I'm sure I'm using irony wrong.
But you have to remember he has a British accent, which always helps.
He does, but it has a nice deep timbre to it, and he can sing fairly well. So it's very pleasant. It's not like listening to his voice is unpleasant. It's just not his premium strength, and he knows that, and plays to his other strengths. But yeah, the song scene is really, really impressive. I thought it was a real language, and I just couldn't speak it for the entirety of it until I got to the very end.
I took a class of French, and I thought he was speaking French, and I just wasn't paying attention.
Like, what? What is this? What French sounds like with a British accent?
It sounds like a French-Italian mix. It's interesting, and it's definitely an interesting study, I guess, in ways to ad-lib language and make it sound real without actually speaking words. And I wonder if that's a technique that he picked up in vaudeville, because that's probably something that would have been useful in a vaudeville act where you're on stage and you can use your voice. So that's just really interesting, but it's such a great scene and such a great way to wrap up this movie.
I actually found it really interesting. Apparently they had to send a special note to the subtitle people who were going to make subtitles for the foreign release of the film to not make subtitles for this scene because it's not a real language.
That's great. All right, so now our last film. We come to The Great Dictator in 1940. This is Charlie Chaplin's most audible and most meaningful, I suppose, film as far as the political commentary and all of that. And yet, remember that this film comes out 1940, 1 year before Pearl Harbor happens and before the U.S. has even entered the war. And so, although this film revolves so much around the situation in the ghettos, we did not know the full extent of what was happening in the Holocaust, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the story follows two characters, Hinkle, which is the dictator of Tomania, and just to be frank, this film is a commentary on Hitler, and it's essentially Hitler in Germany and making fun of him on that side. And then on the other side, we have Charlie Chaplin. Well, Charlie Chaplin is playing Hinkle too. That's very important. And on the other side, we have Charlie Chaplin playing a character named a Jewish barber. And one of Charlie Chaplin's defining traits is his little toothbrush mustache, which he takes full advantage of in this film to play both this Jewish barber and Hinkle, the Hitler mockery. And is at the end we're seeing the persecution of the Jewish barber throughout the film, and we're seeing the battle within himself that Hinkle is having over whether or not to persecute the Jews and how to use his dominion. And then at the end there's a quick like Prince and Pauper kind of mix up, and the Jewish barber gets the stand and has just one of the greatest film speeches of all time. Literally Google greatest film speeches of all time, and this speech comes up. So this film just has so much commentary in it, and so many jokes about Hitler and the ghettos and the way the war was, or the way that we saw the war before we entered it and knew what was actually happening. And I guess that's probably the first thing to talk about, is the way that the full realization of what was happening affects the comedy in this movie, looking back on it from today.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly at the time, like, Charlie Chaplin thought it was important to stop Hitler, but not in the sense that he would start a large war, not in the sense that he would commit genocide. The full extent of the camps wasn't widely known about until they started being liberated towards the end of the war. So that happened in 1945-ish, 1944-ish. So from our modern perspective, or really anything after 1945, looking at some of the stuff in this film, like, they actually do go to a concentration camp. Like, people knew that concentration camps were a thing, but they didn't know that there was genocide happening at those concentration camps. So knowing that now, some of it makes it a really, really kind of harder to laugh at. But there are so many parts of this movie that still are so funny, and kind of so relevant, and almost even funnier now that Hitler has become a near mythological evil figure in pop culture.
Yeah, so that's to say that there's kind of two parts to this film where some things are just a little bit too true to be funny, and other things are still funny in the way that they are intended. So, for example, in instances where SS officers are mistreating people, and basically Charlie Chaplin has taken gags that would normally be attributed to normal police officers that has been done in many other silent films prior to this. Officers using their nightsticks and hitting things and accidentally hitting the wrong people and that kind of thing takes on a completely different meaning when you put it in the hands of SS officers who literally would just brutally beat people. It becomes not funny when you're making a joke about that, because in a normal situation, police officers, their function isn't to just beat people for no reason, so it becomes kind of funny. That context changes things a lot. And yet other instances where Charlie Chaplin is making fun of Hitler's speeches and how he contrasts the effectiveness of Hitler's speech and how stern and forceful it is, and then he puts on his Hinkle character and he uses the same forcefulness, and he uses a gibberish language that devolves into coughing and choking quite often, and it satirizes it in a way that basically demeans Hitler and turns him into a joke, which can still be funny because we need to sometimes not see him as this huge evil figure. He is just like a really power-hungry child, and that's kind of this element that Charlie Chaplin brings to him until his Jewish barber character takes the stage, and then he puts on pure English and is very clear and is very forceful, and we could talk about that later. So there are elements that still work really well, like some of the power play stuff where another dictator that I think is supposed to be a play on Italy, if I'm not wrong.
Benito Mussolini. Yeah.
He comes in and they're like trying to do some power play things where they put him in this tiny chair, but then he stands up and he has such a forceful personality that he always gets the upper hand of Hinkle. And again, is this demeaning comedy against Hitler over and over again. And some of those points still play off really funny where they're having this debate about something policy wise, but they're at this like buffet table and it turns into a food fight, and that's kind of hilarious, just demoting political negotiations into a food fight and trivializing it. Is just to say that some of these elements play off better in retrospect than others.
Yeah, and the film definitely has kind of multiple goals. It's at once trying to satirize and demean Hitler's global personality at the time, and at the same time, it's also trying to point out how dangerous he is, how he might be a very big threat on the larger global stage. And sometimes those elements aren't at loggerheads, but sometimes they are at loggerheads over the course of the film. Like sometimes, like demeaning him makes him seem like less of a threat than he really is or was, which isn't really like I don't think that's a knock on the film. I think it's a very difficult thing to tackle in a film, and it was a very large project. And I think Chaplin does a really good job of it for what he would have known in 1940. What he would have known of the political landscape and the military landscape of 1940. And a lot of the satire is just really, really funny. Like the speeches that Hinkle gives are hilarious. One, because like the idea of the joke is just funny. Like, some guy spewing hate and all you hear is sputtering, coughing, and the occasional bratwurst and sauerkraut.
Right,
really
he throws
funny.
actual words into his gibberish language, which kind of just even elevates that level of comedy that he brought in the song from Modern Times.
Yeah. And at the same time, like, it's funny because it demeans this really, really bad guy who is full of himself. So there's that. So there's a big political element. This is the most political film that Charlie Chaplin ever made. It was considered somewhat controversial at the time, maybe more controversial as over the next few decades, as Chaplin himself came under fire from whatever the name of the blacklist committee was in Congress and the whole Hollywood blacklist thing, which we won't get into here. But at the time, it was a huge hit. It was a giant hit. It was really, really popular. And kind of, some say, helped sway a lot of opinions in America closer to being willing to engage in World War II. And of course, we all know, that was Pearl Harbor that did that. I'm not crediting this film, but that is to say, like, it had a big widespread impression across global audiences.
And I do want to throw out there before we get too much farther, just in the context of, the way that things have aged in this film. Chaplin himself said several years later, after the war had ended and, all our intelligence had come to light, that had he known the full extent of what happened in Germany, he probably would have never made The Great Dictator and would have never made fun of the events. And so it's just kind of amazing to see how we got this film literally just 1 year before we entered into it and realized that this is not a joking matter. This is the worst conflict in human history, which is just insane. And yet it's still, as funny as it is, again, it is probably still his most powerful film because of that speech at the end where he uses the same platform and literally puts himself in the place of Hitler, having that power of speech, and he uses the same kind of intonation and forcefulness to give one of the best just rally cries and humanizing speeches that we've seen in cinema. And it's just such a great way for Charlie Chaplin, the silent film star, to prove his worth with words and with sound. And so, putting that in context of all three of these films, we're definitely seeing that evolution. And, even just to bring it back to Singing in the Rain, is kind of the opposite. He did not fade from memory. He didn't flounder when sound came about. He actually started to flourish and incorporate that, even if he was a little later to the game.
Yeah, which was very interesting because a lot of his contemporaries didn't. Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd, probably chief among them, did not survive in the sound age with the same kind of level of success that they had without in the silent era. But that is to say, this film still hits all of those Chaplin notes that we talked about for the last two, where we talked about him setting up himself for very physical comedy, whether it be being chased around by SS officers on the street, or him as Hinkle dancing with a balloon version of the globe.
Which again is poignant and hilarious.
Yeah, it really is. It's meaningful and hilarious at the same time.
Because at the end of this scene of Hinkle having this balloon globe and bouncing it off of his head and off of his butt and everything, he holds it, just admiring that he's going to be ruler of this world, and then it pops and it explodes, and so you're left with this moment of, oh my gosh, he's going to destroy the world. And he's kind of left with that. And so again, Charlie Chaplin uses comedy, and in this film is using that comedy to convey a message, and does so very well.
Yeah, and I think we've made it very clear that this is now a controversial film in some ways. But of all the people who could have made a comedy about Hitler 1 year before the U.S. joined World War II, I'm glad it was Charlie Chaplin.
Right.
Like, he did it smartly and he did it well. And it is very, very poignant.
And so just talking about how Chaplin incorporates his sound into his comedy, this is, again, a culmination of that. So we have elements or scenes that are basically just silent film scenes, but he adds music to them. So there's a scene where the Jewish barber is giving a shave, and it's put to classical music. I'm going to assume that it's Wagner, because, again, he uses Wagner a lot in this film because it's Hitler's favorite composer, and so that's part of the joke. But he shaves to the music, and there's points where the guy's just sitting there waiting as he's sharpening his knife to the music and waiting for the movement of the music to be over. I don't know if I'm using that term right, but I'm just assuming so. And it's so funny. And the other part where Hinkle has a speech going over the loudspeakers that's changing its tone from very forceful to very quiet, and the Jewish barber is like creeping, trying to get his hat, and so he creeps when the voice is very soft and low, and then he falls back whenever it gets loud and forceful again. And so he's using all of these elements into his physical comedy and showing that his comedy survives even if sound is included.
Okay, and so before we move on into overall notes on Charlie Chaplin, I do want to leave you with a fun fact of the day or night or whenever you may be listening. Charlie Chaplin did believe that Hitler copied his mustache on purpose. Just want to throw that out there. So there was a personal mustache beef there too. And for anyone who's ever pointed out the fact that, wow, those two guys have similar mustaches, those two historical figures kind of look the same. Yeah, there's a movie about that. Go watch it. It's called The Great Dictator.
And the Criterion cover is perfect because it literally has the mustache in the middle and the bowler on top and Hitler's haircut on the bottom.
Yeah. It's pretty well designed.
All right, so transitioning into overall notes, I think it's kind of good to start off with just talking about Charlie Chaplin's tramp character, who basically appears in all three of these. I don't think he technically appears in The Great Dictator, but the Jewish barber dresses and acts in a very similar way. His suit is a little bit more form-fitting in The Great Dictator. but it's all kind of this image that Charlie Chaplin built up for himself. And it's, what we would call nowadays, he built a brand for himself. I'm pretty positive they would not have described it that way back then, but that's what he did. He created an image that is recognizable and that he could carry over into all of his films, and he sets a level of expectations for that. And he's basically, it's kind of like putting his name on it, kind of like we talked about with Frank Capra, where Frank Capra was insistent on putting his name on his films so that you would know what you were getting when you go into a movie. And Charlie Chaplin does that just by his appearance. When you see The Tramp, you can expect the physical comedy, you can expect the timing, you can expect eventually the sound and all of the jokes to just work together perfectly. And he did this very well. And this is kind of probably, again, a holdover from vaudevillian comedy, where people would create characters and they would come up with different skits and sketches. And there are so many other characters and actors from the era that kind of do the same thing. Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd both had very similar things, but they weren't quite as defined as The Tramp was. And, The Tramp looks very different than Charlie Chaplin did in real life. And so that's definitely a character that he was putting on and played very well over and over again.
Certainly. And if you think about the times that Charlie Chaplin lived through and had his career during, then you can recognize why the Tramp character resonated so much, beyond just, the phenomenal talent and skill that Charlie Chaplin brought to bringing him to life and giving him the proper platform to do his thing on. He lived through World War One and the Jazz Age and the collapse after the Jazz Age, the Great Depression. So during all those times, like, portraying a man who is down on his luck and, the little guy who is just trying to survive and smile in the rain and, make what he can of this life, then, you have a very sympathetic audience ready to latch on to a character like that and come back to him over and over again and let that Tramp character make them smile.
And another interesting thing that I was seeing throughout these films is that I was seeing jokes that were darker than I would have expected to see in such old films. And I think I'm probably surprised every time we watch an old film and I see something that's, not as wholesome as, you would expect from something from the 30s. And so, for example, in Modern Times, we have cocaine jokes with the nose candy in jail. And I was like, wow, we really just, let Charlie Chaplin take cocaine and then have all of these hilarious scenes on cocaine. And even in the Gold Rush, our outlaw character is running away from the cops and shoots two cops dead in very Fargo-like fashion. And
which is not something that would be like out of turn nowadays, but like back then, you don't think of like that being like movie fare.
Right. And the Gold Rush was definitely pre-code, and we talked a little bit about the Hays Code and stuff again in the Frank Capra episode. But I'm pretty sure that Modern Times was a couple years after the Hays Code went into effect. So I guess cocaine wasn't covered in that code, or he got away with it because he also was running the studio that he made the film for. And there was also lots of drunkenness and drunk jokes. And then just in general, the comedy about SS officers in The Great Dictator. But again, he didn't know the full extent. But it's just interesting. I'm always surprised when we watch these old films and we see things like that. I'm like, man, these kind of jokes have been happening for longer than I would have realized. And, you don't even see cocaine jokes nowadays very much, except in maybe like the raunchiest of comedies. And so it's just really interesting looking back on all these movies and seeing what things were incorporated in them and what people thought was funny at the time.
Yeah, nobody expects silent films to be as edgy as they are, but they are. Like innovative special effects, cocaine jokes, cop killing, flappers, quote-unquote dance hall girls, which I don't believe is a real profession, but someone correct me if it is. you know, it was an edgy time, y'all. It was, just because it's old doesn't mean it was wholesome. But I also want to talk about, and I think we've brought this up before in a couple episodes that have kind of touched on the topic of silent cinema. But that is kind of the globalized nature of
Universality.
silent cinema, the universality of silent cinema, and how that can appeal across borders and across time too, as we found out, because this is these films are again almost 100 years old, creeping up on it over the next couple decades. They are. We've watched while we were doing research this week. We've watched many documentaries. There's a lot of stuff out there on Charlie Chaplin about different people in different places around the globe who have fallen in love with the character of the tramp and just love him. And the places that people fall in love with him are all over the globe because it's silent. You don't need language to understand him. Even in modern times, you don't need language to understand the tramp. The only time he speaks is at the end, and that's gibberish. So whether it's a schoolhouse in West Africa or if it's a small town in India that is just obsessed with Charlie Chaplin, and I'm sure Jonathan will want to talk about that in a second, the nature of an international film star who doesn't rely on any specific language other than physicality to communicate is really powerful.
Yeah, and to just touch on that, I'll include a link to, like you said, there is a town in India that yearly has a Charlie Chaplin festival where they will gather in the hundreds, all dressed like the tramp, and they just have this big festival and almost worship Charlie Chaplin in a way, but more
I think
just
it's mock worship.
Yeah, it's more paying homage to him. And it's just really incredible to see how much of an effect Charlie Chaplin has had on this little town in India, of all places, and just showing how global cinema can be and how global cinema once was before there was so much cultural context and language necessary to understand what was going on in a film. There's something special about the era of silent film, where you could just pick up the reel of film and put some light through it, and anyone anywhere in the world can get enjoyment out of it. And that's just really special for a medium of art.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I think I love the fact that it's not a thought that I would just have, but like that a town in India would be, like a little town in India would be obsessed with Charlie Chaplin. But once you find out about it, you get that moment of oh, really? And then you just realize how awesome it is, how cool it is that this little this group of people halfway around the world share the love of something that you love, and enjoy something that you enjoy, and how cool that is, and how you don't speak the same language, but you can both still enjoy it. And as I mentioned before, Charlie Chaplin was a talented musician as well, because like we said, he's a man of many bowler hats. He's talented in many things. One of those things was music. He scored all of his films, starting with City Lights, which came out in the early 1930s. And several of his films that were re-released after that, including The Gold Rush, which we talked about today, were then rescored with him doing the rescore. There is a project, I think, sponsored by Criterion or someone associated with Criterion, to take the rescored versions that Chaplin did and retime them to match the silent versions of the film, and re-release those on Filmstruck. And that re-released version of the 1925 silent film with the updated score is now on Filmstruck. Why does it need an updated score? Well, like we mentioned before, the frame rates were a little different once you started incorporating synchronized sound. So the 1942 version of the film is actually a little faster. It's a little sped up compared to the 1925 version. So to get the most accurate 1925 version with the new score, you had to slowed down the score a little bit, the new score to match it. Charlie Chaplin also had his own music label. Fun fact, just throwing it out there.
Yeah, and that all goes into, again, all of the different things that Charlie Chaplin combined into his films as an actor, as a comedian, as a musician, as a director, as like a choreographer. Just the way that he uses his motion and his body, the way that he crafts all of these gags and these scenes. But the main thing that he wanted to be remembered as is a clown. I mean, that's what he was. He says that in a quote where he says, "I remain just one thing and one thing only, and that is a clown. It places me on a far higher plane than any politician." And maybe part of that is, again, this idea that as a clown, he can communicate with anyone in the world with no confusion whatsoever. And he does it very well. And then we see in The Great Dictator that even when he has language, he communicates very clearly and is very well understood by anybody. And again, just to reiterate, like how many artists and comedians have been influenced by Charlie Chaplin as one of the pioneers of the film medium and the film art form. You know, you can see his influence in almost every physical comedian, even stuff that we've talked about recently. Donald O'Connor in Singing in the Rain, his Make 'em Laugh performance is very Chaplin-esque and almost vaudevillian in the way that he uses physical comedy. You can see it in more modern things, like Kramer from Seinfeld has very many instances like that. And like I said, some of the classic TV shows like I Love Lucy and Gilligan's Island pull influences from that. And even filmmakers that we've talked about before that you wouldn't really expect have cited him as a huge influence, like Federico Fellini, who called Chaplin a kind of Adam from whom we're all descended. That's his quote. And, Victoria De Sica, and like, who again was directed Bicycle Thieves, and it was all about the little man and the depressing situation of life, which is what the tramp character was, and he just played it on a comedic angle, whereas Victoria De Sica took the same thing and did it from a more grounded and realistic view. And then Billy Wilder, I think Gene Wilder cited him as an influence as well, and Andrei Tarkovsky even, who we talked about with Stalker, which is like these directors who don't even have a very comedic sense to them in their overall work have been influenced by the pioneering legacy that Charlie Chaplin had. And so, it's it's undeniable how big of an influence Charlie Chaplin has had on every aspect of the filmmaking medium. And, those influences are going to ripple again as long as this medium exists, because he is the originator of many of these things. Again, even cartoons like Mickey Mouse and Felix the Cat are just such a wide-reaching range of influence. It's incredible.
And I mentioned once or twice how great of a job Charlie Chaplin did as a director, directing himself, which sounds funny, but he really did create the best platforms and the best spaces for him as an actor to do such great work. And I also mentioned one or two anecdotes about how demanding he was as a director. In fact, in the very long shoot for The Great Dictator, some footage leaked out of Chaplin, some behind-the-scenes on-set footage leaked out of Chaplin on set in costume as Hinkle, yelling at one of his crew members, and that got some bad press. And Chaplin might have said that the outfit influenced his mood as a director on that shoot a little bit, but most reports said that Chaplin was a bit dictatorial in his directing style. And speaking of someone else who was a bit precise and a bit particular in the way he shot his films, who are we talking about next week, Jonathan?
Next week, we are talking about the legendary Stanley Kubrick, who had not a wide range of films, but had a lot of hits. So we're going to, at least in retrospect, he has a lot of hits that are very well regarded.
Yeah, maybe not at the time, but over time. They were slow burns.
Yeah, so we're going to start off our discussion with his war commentary, which may or may not have some influence from the great dictator, called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb from 1964. And then his space epic 2001, A Space Odyssey from 1968. And his defining horror film, The Shining from 1980, which is available on Netflix currently.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
All right, on to our next film of the day.
I can't believe you just assumed our listeners are listening during the day. You're so timist.
Oh my gosh. Okay.